Hello, everybody. My name is Nate Sheets, and I am excited today to talk to you about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, especially in the context of students and including students. I'm excited to be here, and yeah, let's get started because I have a lot to go through, and I hope that you'll find the training helpful. My name is Nate Sheets, and I'm a behavior consultant. I'm based in Eugene, Oregon right now, and I am the owner of Oregon Behavior Consultation and Cognitive Supports. My experience is what I like to talk about first as I build up my credentials and what I should, or why you should maybe take what I say into consideration, is that I have been around children who have been through trauma and who have displayed challenging behaviors for a long time. And unknowingly, I've been around people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders for a long time. My parents started doing foster care when I was 7 years old in 1993. And throughout that time, I was able to get some kind of idea, right, as a teenager, with the systems and how the systems support these kids. And of course, just by the nature of fetal alcohol and foster care, of course, a lot of people experience, whether they're the child who's in the system or a parent trying to support them, the dysfunctional child welfare system and how that can be traumatizing for all involved. My parents also were frequently dismissed by school professionals and mental health professionals and not believed when it came to some of these challenging behaviors. And this is outside of a fetal alcohol context. And of course, it will be very closely related as we continue. My parents were among the first foster providers to be called therapeutic foster parents, meaning they had additional training and they were expecting to handle some of the challenging behaviors that frequently come with children who have been through a lot of stuff and stress. As my career started, I've had 12 years of experience directly with developmental disabilities. Half of my career thus far was spent at a foster care agency where I was doing multiple roles, but mostly case management and behavior support for families and children. And that allowed me to kind of look at all areas of life, including school, including medical, including therapy, and try to work towards solutions, especially when we think about how difficult it can be to work with somebody with a developmental disability and to know what is their learning style and how can I most effectively support them. When it comes to my education, I have a business administration degree. And so I like to say this at the beginning because I am going to be taking an approach that is very brain-based. And so because I'm self-taught when it comes to the brain, it's very important for me to be correct. I do view what I'm talking about as the current thoughts on neuroscience and trauma, and I'll be talking about those a lot. But with that being said, if there's anything that doesn't ring true or you have any corrections, I'm always willing to hear those and make sure that I'm correct. Before we talk about some of the challenges that you might see with somebody with a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, it's important that I emphasize that there are positive traits. Of course, that's true with anybody, but it can be true for a lot of people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And for a lot of parents or teachers, it's difficult to see the positives when we have our own agenda as to how they need to learn or the work that they need to get done. And of course, when they're displaying challenging behaviors. So people, whether they're kids or adults who have FASDs, they are often good with animals. They're often good at speaking and expressing themselves, at least on a basic level. They're often empathetic, and they can be successful. They can often work if they're given supports, or if they just don't come up against a lot of the hurdles that other people might. They can be successful in childcare. They can be good at customer service and food service, and even social work and caregiving. They're often frequently talented either in art or in music, with legit talents, right? With not like, oh, that's so cute, but like actual talents and impressive skills. They're often great younger kids, and they're often motivated to help others and to stick up for those who they think are being oppressed or being treated unfairly. They're often noted for being very social and being friendly when they're doing well, of course. And they also have cognitive and academic strengths that may not be consistent, and we'll talk about that. And in a sense, it's all of these strengths that make FASDs an invisible disability. And that is difficult for us as the adults or the supporters, because we forget that even though this person is appearing typical, in this moment where my brain is also reacting, am I supporting them in a way that somebody with a developmental disability needs to be supported? And we find that often the answer is no. We move things too quickly. We move things at a neurotypical rate, and people get left behind, and challenging behaviors directly result. So let's go over just some basics of what fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are. We know that prenatal exposure to alcohol in the womb is the #1 cause of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, intellectual disabilities, and learning disabilities in the entire world. And the prevalence of a recent study, the conservative estimates were anywhere between 1.3% to 5% of first graders, I believe. It might be second graders, but I think it's first graders. And the weighted approach that the same study used puts the prevalence between 3 to 9% of first graders meeting the criteria for an actual fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. This is, of course, higher than prevalence rate for autism. And yet, we don't have a fetal alcohol checkbox on an IEP. And very few people, they've heard of usually what they call fetal alcohol syndrome, but they don't actually know what that means. They don't know how prevalent it is, and they sure as heck don't know how to support somebody with an FASD. And so a big part of the challenges we have to acknowledge as people who work within the systems is that the systems themselves can create a problem. And there's many different systems that somebody with a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder might encounter. School, of course, is one. Mental health, if they go into therapy, foster care, and just being in society with a society that really does not understand why challenging behaviors occur, that really does not understand basic human behaviors, and does not understand how somebody can do something on one day, but not do it on another day. And the systems, when I refer to that, it can include us, right? The teachers, the paraeducators, behavior consultants like me, we're a part of that. Our processes for how we do things. So, for example, doing a functional behavior assessment, the stated ideals and goals of the system, and the policies and laws governing the system. All of those have influences, and unfortunately, oftentimes negative influences on students with FASDs. And again, in my opinion anyway, the overall issue is that the systems are neither equipped or informed to support people with FASDs, or if we pause FASDs, people with invisible disabilities, people who have inconsistent skills and who are able to do things on one day but not another, people who experience ongoing sensory dysregulation. Those behaviors or results of that dysregulation is often misinterpreted as intentional misbehavior. They are often not aware of trauma, and while we are trying to make progress in trauma-informed care, it has yet to take hold enough to produce an overall positive effect for people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And of course, the systems do not know how to handle challenging behaviors. And unfortunately, in as gentle a way as possible, the worst of this is often at school. And so when schools are responding traditionally or in punitive ways to challenging behaviors, it adds to the stress and overall trauma of a child. So today I hope to clarify why that is, and how, alternatives and a different framework really, and understanding what's going on. Ultimately, we have probably somewhere around 5% of the population or more, which is a huge, huge number of people who experience virtually no system support. And as a consultant and specialist in fetal alcohol, I have people all over the world reaching out to me every month, asking me, where can I get these resources? And I usually have no idea. There is virtually nothing for fetal alcohol spectrum disorders out there. There are a few organizations, but a lot of those organizations are focused on prevention. which is not going to help people who are already born, who are already in our systems. And so all of this leads to stress. And ongoing stress for any child, regardless of whether or not they have a developmental disability, becomes traumatic over time. And it's that trauma that only makes the behaviors worse, that makes trying to connect with them worse, and that creates a lot of confusion as to what's going on with these behaviors. And so when there's system stress, it's not just the person who's feeling stressed, though of course they do. Their behaviors are continually misunderstood and then therefore punished in ineffective ways. They're continually held to too high of expectations. We'll talk about that. And they often lose relationships because people don't understand. They see somebody who's appearing to be aggressive or mean, not understanding the deeper reasons for that, and the person not really getting effective help to start to regulate those behaviors to avoid that response. Families are very, very much stressed. I work with a lot of families who are desperate for resources, for support, and they just don't get them. So everything is on the parents. And now, of course, with COVID and a lot of learning happening online, that's only going to create more and more stress for a lot of parents as they try to meet the expectations of schools who are telling them they need to do a certain amount of work, or even just sitting some of these kids down in front of the computer is a big deal and is very complex in terms of why it doesn't work for that child. And then, of course, we as the professionals get stressed and we don't have the knowledge or the support or the ability to consult with others about fetal alcohol. We feel like we're failing, and we can see it happening often through challenging behaviors or through displacement of the child when we feel like we can't handle them in our setting anymore. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, when we refer to that, or FASDs, it's a group of disorders that are given to people who were exposed to alcohol in the womb. It's very important that you understand that most fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are invisible. And so if the first thing that comes to your mind or that comes out of somebody else's mouth when this is mentioned is, well, what about facial features, or they don't have the facial features? The vast majority of people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders do not have the classic facial features. And so it contributes again to this idea of invisible disability. And because of this and this high stigma around just bringing up alcohol consumption while pregnant, it's often misdiagnosed as autism or ADHD when the child is younger. And while that might provide some support, it's still off the mark and not really getting to the cognitive reality of what's going on. Delays are often significant. So young children with FASDs have a lot of strengths, and in those early years, they can actually keep up with school and things seem to be fine. But then there's a point where things become much more abstract, where they have to read in order to learn, where peer interactions go from play to just kind of talking and chatting. And in those moments, it becomes a lot harder for the person with an FASD to participate. So in terms of the specific diagnoses that are under the umbrella of the FASD diagnoses, here's a list of them. There's fetal alcohol syndrome. A lot of people have heard that, but that means that you meet specific criteria. And very few people with an FASD meet the fetal alcohol syndrome category. So we start to see more diagnoses like alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorders or neurobehavioral disorders, which are then associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. Again, we're talking about potentially 5 to almost 10% of the population. And so if your student has been diagnosed with any of these, we say that they have an FASD. So that's why I refer to FASDs. Here's a little humor for you. Again, many parents wait months and months for an evaluation to get a diagnosis, and they will go to the professional, and the first thing the psychologist, the neuropsychologist might say is, well, what about the facial features? Even in the mental health community, very little is known about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And so then to wait only to be shut down in the first few seconds of the interaction is very, very discouraging. And I've heard it all the time, and it's very, very common. We're going to be talking today in part 1 and part 2 of this presentation about what we can expect in somebody with a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But of course, as is the purpose of an IEP, we have to individualize. And this is, of course, true for any child. And so not everything I mention will necessarily be manifested as an issue in this person. I'm just talking about what we might expect and potentially provide supports for. And the good news is a lot of the supports that I'll suggest actually will provide supports for many different skills at once, which is a benefit. And so I also have to mention, and we'll spend part of this presentation talking about how a big picture of this actually doesn't have anything to do with FASD. There are non-FASD considerations that also have to be taken into consideration. But that being said, FASD is considered to be a whole body disorder, and no matter what we do with them or what we're addressing, we still have to understand how that FASD brain works so we can teach them effectively. And if we can do that, and if we can figure that out, they can make really good improvements. But usually what's going on is that we as the adults are trying to get them to work with what's easier for us or with how our system is set up, and that just is not going to work, and it contributes to trauma. From the outside, when somebody is struggling with these skills, we see behaviors, we observe behaviors, and some methods of behavior, including those in schools, such as when we're doing a functional behavior assessment and part of positive behavior intervention support, we kind of glorify observable behaviors, but I'm actually going to tell you that observable behaviors are not the big picture here, though that might make some behavior professionals gasp. On the outside, we see impulsivity. We see those impulsive or risky behaviors. We see what appears to be lying, but actually, as we will learn, there's probably more to the story going on. We see what appears to be stealing. We see a lot of risk takings that don't make any sense to us. And we're like, why are they doing this? They'll often refuse to start a task, or they'll be unable to start a task. They will often refuse to do schoolwork, which of course is applicable for us, or homework when they get home. And they often struggle with emotional regulation challenges, which really we should expect given what we know about how human brains work. And we'll talk about emotional regulation. Another thing that often happens, at least with some of them, is that they'll struggle in their interactions with peers, maybe because of their behaviors when they're around the peers, maybe because of the direct interactions themselves and the difficulties there. But that adds again to the stress. And a lot of them are very good at making friends. They're good at expressing, right? So they have these good basic social interaction abilities, but then when it comes to the depth and the sustaining of those relationships, they struggle. And so they can make friends easily, but struggle to keep them. And because of the systems and how we interpret and respond to behaviors, oftentimes people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are involved with police or with the justice system. And just so you know, the justice system is not equipped to work with people with FASDs. So we send them into a system that is going to only traumatize them and make things worse. A big part of what guides me and what I do is this idea by Dr. Ross Greene called, it's from his collaborative and, hold on. We call it CPS, Collaborative and Proactive Solutions is what it's called now. And he wrote the book, The Explosive Child. And many teachers have heard of collaborative problem solving or collaborative and proactive solutions. But when it comes to implementing these with people with developmental disabilities, it doesn't really work out in the way that we are hoping or the way the book would have us to believe. And so a lot of what I'm doing here is getting us to the point where we can actually effectively collaborate with somebody with a developmental disability. But we have to constantly consider, what does collaboration take in the brain? And a big part of his book, which changed my lens and I've continued to see reinforced throughout literature, is the idea that your explanation for what you're seeing in front of you guides your intervention. When we do FBAs for school and we reduce behaviors to 4 functions, that will cause us to then respond in a certain way. So if I think somebody's doing it for attention, then I'm going to respond in a certain way. So let me just give you an example here. If I think that a child is having any behavior because it is intentional, if I assume intention on their part, or them not wanting to do it, I will naturally, impulsively, a lot of the time, be disposed to punishing them, or I will try the rewards and the sticker charts with them, which are ultimately ineffective. I will lecture them, or I'll ask them ineffective, abstract questions like, why are you doing this? Why did you hit your friend? Right? They're not going to be able to tell you the whys in the way that we're going to look at what the whys actually are. And this leads, of course, eventually, when the behaviors don't improve, to suspensions or expulsions, displacement from school to school to school, which only contributes to trauma, or from home to home, family home, foster home, that happens, and of course, arrest. All of these things happen with the paradigm of behaviors are intentional. And challenging behaviors are intentional. But when we think of things in terms of what I'm going to challenge you to think of them as, and what collaborative and proactive solutions states, which is behaviors are the result of being expected to use a skill that you can't access in any given moment, right? And I'll break this down in a second. But if we think, okay, there's a skill block here or a skill deficit here, it's going to naturally dispose us, sometimes impulsively, to go in a very different direction. If something's a problem because it's a skill deficit, we know it will be a problem again, which means that even though we had an issue, we can be somewhat proactive for the next time because we know that that will continue to be a problem for a while. It will allow us to think more effectively of what accommodations the person needs, and to even think completely differently within our special education programs as to what can help this student succeed. It also allows us to empathize, which is a big part of this. We can ask ourselves, what would it be like if I had their attention span, or if I had their lack of impulse control, or if I could not resist distractions in the same way as them, and think about what would our life look like and maybe come up with some practical solutions. We can also help the person learn about what's going on in their brain, and learn about our own brains, because it's just as applicable to all of us in a lot of times, and then work together eventually to come up with ways to move forward. And especially for me or parents, it allows us to be able to advocate for what our child really needs. And when we reframe behaviors in this skills way, when we think of a skill versus intentionality, it makes things easier on us emotionally. We no longer have to see this kid as a little brat, right? We can understand all of the things that are leading to this moment. And in fact, the behavior that we're having right now, the screaming or the resistance or the whatever, is way not about what I'm actually demanding of them in a moment, but it's all of the things that have happened to them leading up to that and their lack of coping skills because of that. It also allows us to problem solve. Again, if it's a problem now and it's skill-based, it's going to be an issue later. And so we can try to anticipate that and put supports in place proactively. And I'm going to argue that this approach is way more accurate than our gut reactions, especially as people who have parented typical children and traditional parenting styles, or people who've been providing educational services for a long time, right? We have our instincts as to what kids are doing, but I'm going to argue that those gut instincts are usually wrong, even with neurotypical children. And so we want to look at traditional views of behavior versus the lens change that I'm asking you to do today. Traditional views of behavior believe that we learn acceptable behaviors by having our good behavior reinforced and bad behavior punished. And while positive behavior intervention support does not necessarily promote punishment, it is still based on this idea. And a lot of the interventions end up being punishments anyway. But we use other euphemisms like natural consequences, right? But it's still essentially punishment. And it doesn't work. I wouldn't have a job if punishments worked for these kids. And so we have to look at something different. Otherwise, we're only adding to their trauma. If we see a child or a teenager refusing to do something, we'll use terms like, well, they just want to be in control. As if the answer is, well, then they should just stop wanting to be in control. Or they just want to get something. But we don't look at the deeper reasons for that. And so we end up often resorting to things that are punitive or punishment. And when children and teens have bad behaviors, we often blame the kid themselves. We say they are unempathetic, they're mean, they're rude, they're disrespectful, or we blame their parents. And I have been on both sides of the aisle here in terms of I have seen us bash the parents, and I have been a part of bashing the parents. And I have seen on the other side where the parents know they're being bashed and unbelieved, and that is a problem. And so a big part of my approach is to believe parents. And what I find is they're usually telling the truth, because these behaviors can get very bizarre. And so having that backup and emotional support from professionals can be very helpful, just on that emotional level. When we take this different view of there's an issue of skill, which means it's not that the person won't, it's that the person can't. So we look at them as can't versus won't. We see that challenging behaviors happen when someone is expected to use cognitive skills that they either have not yet developed, or in that moment that they can't access, which is how our brains work. It is not surprising at all that these behaviors happen when we know the bigger picture here. We are going to then be able to assume that kids want to be successful, right? But they're going to need supports in order to be successful. And if they're not given those supports, then they're not going to be able to be successful. But then we often blame them for that, right? And then we go in an unhelpful direction. And so we also will understand that skills building will learn when our expectations and interactions and the situations that we expose kids to are appropriately supported. And so we'll talk about what that can practically look like throughout the training today. In terms of the specific cognitive skills that we're going to expect most people with FASDs to struggle with, a few of them. One of the big ones is processing verbal language in real time, right? So right now you're processing my verbal language probably in real time. A person with an FASD would not be able to sit through my presentation in most cases, maybe if they are an older adult. And so it's that in the moment processing that we are almost always going to struggle with, right? And so if you're thinking of a student of yours who has an FASD, or really any of your students who have high behaviors, a lot of times we think, nope, they got it, right? Because our own brains miss the cues that they're actually processing. And because everybody's brain is amazing, there are adaptations we make to move through situations. So kids will say, right? Or they'll nod their head. And as we ourselves are just kind of going from moment to moment, right? And we're just going throughout our day, we'll see the nod and we'll take that as affirmation and move on. And that, of course, can lead to issues later. Maybe they didn't fully process, or as we'll see, maybe a lot of other skill deficits did something with the information and it cannot be retrieved. Generally speaking, people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are going to struggle with executive functions. And those are our skills that are theoretically located in our prefrontal cortex at the very front. And that's going to include things like attention and impulse control and planning and problem solving and flexibility and transitioning from one thing or one thought to another. And ultimately, our emotional regulation. And as we're going to learn, if you struggle with executive functioning on the basic levels, you're not going to be able to regulate your emotions. So then to expect these kids to immediately comply, right, or to show not the slightest bit of behavior, or, to not have a few moments of having a moment is actually very unreasonable, especially when we consider that we adults have the freedom to do that, and we don't have somebody immediately correcting us in most situations. Another thing that is almost always going to be an issue is processing speed. So a lot of times people with FASDs, they can process information if they're given that time. But what happens is we interrupt that thinking process, right? Because we're constantly talking, or we're moving along too quickly and forcing them to keep adjusting. And so that information doesn't get processed. Whereas if we leave them alone for a second and give them that time, and it can take a long time, sometimes hours, sometimes days, we see that they can make the connections. And that's what we want to do. We want to bend over backwards to give them that time so they can complete the thought process, which if we do enough will eventually lead to faster and faster processing speed of certain concepts. And a lot of times we're going to expect memory issues. And this is pretty variable in terms of the type of memory issues that we'll see. But oftentimes what we think of as short-term or immediate memory is lost. Or maybe for some people, it's more of their long-term memories. And for some people, it's all of the types of memories. So that will definitely be dependent on person by person. I'm going to give you all a very, very short introduction to my overall approach, which I call cognitive supports. And this is when we are using interventions not to focus so much on the behavior, but to support a skill, preferably in a proactive context. And so you likely already use a lot of my suggestions, but what makes them a cognitive support is when you as the teacher or the paraeducator or the adult have a specific skill in mind. So I'm being quiet and letting this kid think because I'm supporting their attention span or because I'm supporting their memory, right? There's multiple skills that one potential support. So as long as they have at least one skill in mind, that's what we call cognitive supports. And the steps through my framework here is understanding what's going on and changing our lens. And this is a big step. We have to understand the brain. We have to understand fetal alcohol. We probably are going to have to understand trauma and polyvagal theory. We are going to have to understand so many different elements of who a person is if we're going to effectively address their behavior. The next part is how we as the adults think ahead so we can be proactive instead of so reactive in these situations. And we are much more naturally disposed to be reactive, right? We're doing our thing the way we want to do it, maybe with some accommodations in place, but then it doesn't go according to plan. And now we're kind of at this standstill of potential power struggle or what. And so we want to just improve our ability to think ahead and be proactive. And it's hard to do. This is not a perfect process. It can be very clunky. It can be discouraging when things don't work, but this is not about fixing things quickly or getting compliance, right? It's focusing on how do we help their brain so we can connect with them and then put them in a place where they can learn. And a big part of this as well is adjusting expectations, which we do to a significant degree through the IEP process. Maybe a child starts school later in the day because that works for them. That's great, right? Maybe they don't do a full day of work. Maybe we have them do some of the problems. Maybe they have a one-on-one para. All of those are examples of adjusting expectations. And we're going to want to continue asking ourselves, are my expectations cognitively reasonable? And probably the biggest part in terms of supporting a person with a developmental disability, this whole process is how we shift our approach, which takes an incredible amount of mindfulness and skill on our part to do it in a way that fosters the safety, connection, and learning that a lot of these students need. And also, of course, the physical environment. There are definitely restraints in the system, but I'm going to tell you, if somebody struggles with distractions and they have 3 or 4 peers making noise as they're talking around them, even if everybody's doing well, that's not going to work for their brain. And so we can't keep forcing the kid in that scenario and then being discouraged by the lack of results. We have to ask, how do we change the system to work with this? How can I actually help this kiddo separate away from this noise with my limited resources, or completely rethink the scenario so they can more effectively learn? All of this leads to, very slowly, the idea of collaboration with the person with a developmental disability or with fetal alcohol. And this is the collaboration part in collaborative and proactive solutions. But just to have that conversation, right, much less finding a way to effectively collaborate, will take time. And we have to, of course, always consider the specific skills that each of these demand. Cognitive supports comes from 3 major sources. I've already mentioned the first one, Collaborative and Proactive Solutions by Dr. Ross Green. I was exposed to this book my very first week of working in developmental disabilities, and I actually was able to train with Dr. Green right away. And I didn't even know who he was. I didn't realize how big of a deal that was, but it was so helpful for me to start off my career in the foster care system with a lens change of behavior. And how my brain works is I clung on to actually a very small part of that, which is the skills. And that is what I essentially focus the vast majority of my behavior supports on. And so, it wasn't his intention, but Dr. Green turned me on to neuroscience, which is what I'm basing a lot of this on. Another big influence is fetal alcohol specific, and that is put forth in a book called Trying Differently Rather Than Harder by Diane Melvin. And this can be a good book. It's quick to read. And this goes through how we really do need to adjust expectations based upon what we know about the brains of people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And this is all part of what's called the neurobehavioral model. You cannot hold somebody to expectations cognitively that they cannot meet and expect them to be successful. But we do it all the time, and then we punish them for not being successful. And that's pretty much what drives me as a professional, is I believe that even with neurotypical children, the adults are wrong, right? Our responses are wrong. We are interpreting what's going on wrong, even if we feel like, with most kids, our responses are effective, because it's effective in a way that we are not anticipating. And effective is a very loose term in terms of punishments. Another big influence is understanding polyvagal theory, which polyvagal theory was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges. But this book, Beyond Behaviors by Dr. Mona Delahuck, is my number one recommendation. If you are a teacher, if you're a paraeducator, if you are a parent, if you're an uncle, if you are interested in how the brain develops, or if you're interested in digging into human behavior in general, this is the book I'm going to recommend you to. And what we'll learn is, even for kids who have not been through what we think of as early childhood trauma, if they've had ongoing stress for any reason, that is trauma. If they have had ongoing sensory dysregulation, even without a lot of the significant behaviors, there's trauma, and there are brain and body responses happening that influence, if not their behaviors, their ability to learn. And so we might think that a kiddo's doing okay because their behaviors have improved, but the question is, well, are they learning in the school environment? And unfortunately, the school environment is full of cues that trick the brain, and not the executive functioning, but the parts of the brain that they have no control over, into thinking that they're unsafe, which is why we have reactivity or opposition, or on the other hand, kids that shut down. So again, I highly, highly recommend it. If there's one resource to take away from today's training, even over my own, it would be this book. And so we can look at this idea of cognitive skills and our traditional responses to behaviors and see why maybe it's not going to work for a child or teenager with an FASD. A big one is just talking to them about it. And, we say, well, why did you do that? What could you do next time? And we do that whole thing, and we do it many times. But unfortunately, this is abstract, and we get frustrated because for a lot of kids, we'll ask them and they'll know all the answers. They know they shouldn't hit somebody. They know that they could take deep breaths when they get upset, but then it doesn't happen in the moment, right? And so for some, the idea of the future is too abstract, but then for others, it doesn't actually provide that in the moment support. Their brain doesn't think about that conversation you had with them 2 days ago, 2 weeks ago, or even sometimes 2 minutes ago. And this is not surprising. This is not an excuse. This is what we know about how our brains work and when there are deficits in executive functioning. They're likely not understanding all that's being said. And they're not even necessarily going to recognize that. They're going to think, yeah, I got the gist of that. And they'll parrot back some words to you. But there could be major concepts that you were hoping they would pick up on that they didn't actually pick up on, or in the way that you were hoping. We know that people with FASDs struggle with memory and recalling memory at all, or recalling it accurately. This leads to a lot of confusion and a lot of accusations of dishonesty and lying. But we know their brains struggle with remembering. So making that verbal plan isn't going to help them, again, in the moment especially. And unfortunately, we do this with kids, and when they do not change their behavior, we blame them for the lack of success. We think they're being non-compliant, but that's not what's going on. We'll often do signing a contract, right? Where they promise to do certain things or not to do certain things. But again, we have to consider, does this contract, does this support actually support the skills, like their emotional dysregulation? Really, it doesn't. We're kind of assuming that it's all about them making a promise or trying harder, but that's not what's going to help. We're essentially saying try harder just by signing this contract. But if there are no supports other than that, they're not going to improve. But oftentimes when that happens and that lack of improvement happens, we interpret it as lack of compliance and therefore respond punitively. We also do points and star charts and sticker systems and what I call good luck with that plans. And again, we have to think this can be tricky because the kiddo, because they want the reward and they are motivated to do well. They're not scamming us. They are enthusiastic to do well. And they give us that feedback. We're encouraged. They're encouraged. But again, does this sticker chart provide an in-the-moment support? No, it does not. They are not thinking of that sticker chart when their brain is shutting down the whatever executive function they might have because they are feeling like something is unsafe. Long-term incentives, especially if we're trying to change behavior through a sticker chart or whatever long-term, that doesn't work. And that's not even a fetal alcohol thing. That is a human brain thing. Rewards are, if effective at all, will only be effective a couple of times before the brain stops getting the same motivation and abilities from that. And of course, again, it's like, well, if they wanted to earn it, they should have done this, right? But that is a big misunderstanding of not only the behaviors of kids with developmental disabilities and fetal alcohol, but of human behavior in general. And so I showed this slide earlier, what we see on the outside that's going on, but then we have to be aware of what we cannot see. We cannot see brain processes happening in the vast majority of cases, right? We can't necessarily see that they're processing slowly. We can't see that they're not catching all that we're saying or that their brain is forgetting it later on. We kind of interpret them as knowing exactly what they're doing and making the wrong choice, when really how executive functioning or dysfunction works is their brain isn't thinking about the consequences. So that's not part of whatever calculation it makes to initiate the behavior. The body is often moving before the brain can think. This is true when a kiddo is hyperactive and not necessarily angry. And this is also true, of course, when they're escalated. And this can be true in everyday moments, right? Where there are things going on that can cue their motor system to respond in a way that we think is inappropriate. Maybe they're touching their peers in that hyperactive way. They have that crazed look on their face. And it's like, dude, just stop. But they don't. But we know what's going on there, and we'll continue to talk about that. Another thing about people with fetal alcohol, again, we're talking about at least 5 to 10% of the population, or 3 to 5% of the population. They're going to want to appear normal, right? So most people who have prenatal alcohol exposure have never even considered it. They have not been diagnosed. It's never been brought up. And even those where that is a known factor, they want to appear normal. They want to fit in with their friends, right? And a big part of that is what the adults have been expecting of them. Essentially, a lot of our behavior guidelines have been, you need to fit in with everybody else. Don't do that. That looks silly. Right? We use our own biases as adults into what kids should look like, which only adds more expectation. And so we don't allow people the freedom to be a little bit different in a lot of cases, even within programs where different people are supposed to fit in, like special education or developmental disability programs. Another issue with fetal alcohol and with a lot of developmental disabilities is that their brain can get stuck and it will not process the same way each time, which means that they're going to be able to do something on one day or give you information about something on one day, and then the next day they will not be able to. And your interpretation guides your intervention, or your explanation guides your intervention, right? And so if you think the kiddo's scamming you, you're going to immediately go into that mode. But if we remember, oh, wait, it is expected that somebody with these brain issues will be able to do something on one day but not another, we'll have a little bit more compassion. We'll slow things down and really think about what's the best way to respond here. And hopefully that's not push them through it, because that's not going to be effective, even though we feel that pressure, especially as professionals. And just to give you kind of the clearest explanation of how I view behaviors is this. Every situation, every expectation, every interaction demands cognitive skills, essentially every waking moment. And so we can think of situations as being recipes. We have something like having a friend over, which to most of us is easy. We don't think of it in terms of skills, but millisecond by millisecond, that interaction, even if it's short, will demand certain skills. They have to be able to have an attention span to focus on the interaction or their friend. There are distractions going on. There are sensory distractions that they have to resist in order to connect with their friend. Impulse control, emotional regulation. If their friend wants to do something slightly different, they're going to need to be flexible and regulate the emotions while they're doing that, et cetera, et cetera. I look at 48 different skills. So these are not exhaustive skill lists. These are mostly executive functioning skills. Something like sitting down to do 5 minutes of homework. That's not simple, right? We think of it as a very low expectation, but especially at the end of the day, we're going to learn end of day is not the time to be demanding skills, right? And so it's very important that, especially as teachers, if we know that our expectation of homework is making the parent's life a living hell because they're dealing with explosive behaviors because of that, we have to stop the homework expectation. It's not an option. It sounds extreme, but that's where we have to start, is by bending over backwards to stop those extreme responses and then building the student up in a truly individualized way to where someday maybe they'll be able to handle homework and maybe they won't. We don't care, right? And with special education, we understand people will have different needs and they might need to be accommodated with that. And so what I do when anybody's describing a behavior to me, whether it's a parent or professional, is I put it through what I call the cognitive skills filter. A very common thing people say is she does it for attention. I'm going to encourage you to take that out of your vocabulary. Because even in some cases, if that were true, there are many other interpretations that will actually help us. But when we think, oh, she's just doing it for attention, that doesn't necessarily give us a lot of non-punitive supports. Maybe we try to meet it proactively, but that will not necessarily always meet the need in the moment. And so maybe, again, we can make one of many, many different interpretations. So just as an example, maybe if she's struggling to self-entertain and she continually is coming back to adults to interact or to demand their attention, it's actually because she cannot self-entertain, because to self-entertain demands a certain set of cognitive skills. He won't keep his hands to himself. Well, if we look at how the body and the brain respond to sensory stimuli and dysregulation, we can realize that his body and his brain are dysregulated versus something that's on him to do. He needs to keep his hands to himself. We might think that somebody lies because they like drama. I get that from a lot of parents. Drama is not a cognitive skill, and liking drama is not a cognitive skill. And so again, there can be many things going on. Something that is fetal alcohol specific is confabulation. And I'll talk more about what that is, but it's the brain lying to you, not the kid. And so that can create false details, which we recognize as the adults are false details, but then we think is intentional. And so this can cause confusion or escalation. We might put a characteristic on the kiddo, like he's being a little asshole or a brat, and that's not a cognitive skill. We have to look at how these kids do not have the skills to regulate stress, especially if they've been experiencing ongoing difficulties or trauma and have not been supported appropriately. We're not going to expect emotional regulation the first week of class, especially if you're the first adult in their life potentially making this shift in thinking. And so it's going to be a long road. We're undoing a lot of years of negative reinforcement of pathways in the brain and a lot of feelings of lack of safety and what should be nurturing and loving environments. They just don't want to do their homework versus they don't have the executive functioning fuel right now. We're going to talk specifically about executive functioning fuel. I also I do not really care about the big behaviors in my everyday career. People will describe the behaviors. Of course, I'm supposed to assess those behaviors, but I am interested in little moments. I'm interested in a conversation between the two of you that's not even about anything emotionally dysregulated. I'm interested in how the adults read the cues of that child. I'm curious as to how that child plays by themselves and explores the world and what on their sensory system is pleasurable. And understanding how their brain works that way. And so for that reason, like in terms of observing behaviors and coming up with a function of those behaviors, it's not really going to put us in a helpful direction with especially the toughest of the tough kids, at least in my opinion. When we're able to focus on the little moments, second by second by second, it can again help us understand what the person is going through. They might have 2 seconds of an attention span before it's redirected, but you're sitting there talking to them for 30 seconds. But then we oftentimes get mad at them for that. We say, pay attention, pay attention. They're not choosing to be distracted. They're not choosing to not be able to hold their attention, especially with fetal alcohol and executive dysfunction. It's what we would expect. And thankfully, attention span can improve as time goes on and more brain development happens. But if there's constant stress about it, it probably will not improve, right? Or they're not going to stick around long enough before they're displaced because of their challenging behaviors, because we're making a big deal out of what is ultimately something out of their direct control. It allows us to take a problem-solving angle and eventually include the person. Because again, if they're struggling with their attention span now and it's a frustration for me, I know that's going to be an issue tomorrow, something like that. We can also try a lot of different supports. And this is what I encourage parents to do and teachers to do, which is whenever we try something, think of it as an experiment. Because even if it doesn't work to address whatever is the agenda on your mind, it can give you information, right? So if I think, okay, they need more support in their attention span, and I put things in place there, and none of those things are really working, I might have the wrong skill. So I can move on to something else like impulse control or transitioning or planning and problem solving, one of the many skills. And so we also can remember that because of the demands of easy expectations, moment to moment, that the person is probably trying their hardest, but they just don't have the tools right now to use them or to access them. When we don't focus on the little moments, we continually hold the person to expectations that they can't meet. And we do it unintentionally. When I constantly talk about unreasonable expectations, the vast majority of the time, I'm talking about us doing it with the best of intentions, right? With what we think will work, with an extreme amount of patience, but yet our expectations might ultimately still be too high in the moment to moment. And of course, a big part of this is helping the systems understand that. So it's going to take more resources to truly support these kids. And so you're going to need support from your system in order to do that. We often blame them for failing to meet those unreasonable expectations. And by having these little clashes with them and constantly correcting them and holding them to too high of expectations, we begin to create the negative interaction patterns that eventually manifests in we walk up to the student and they're immediately reactive. Even if we're going to say good morning, right? Or if we're going to ask them to do something that's very simple, which they could do, they are so used to the interaction being negative, their brain shortcuts there and goes into defensive mode. Of course, they're choosing to do the lawn outside my apartment right now, so I apologize if there's any noise. And another thing is if we're not looking at moment to moment, we tend to focus on the bigger behaviors rather than on the supports that those moments actually require. And so we want to remember that everybody's brain, including our own, we learn, we react, and we respond in tiny time frames, milliseconds and seconds. And it only takes a moment for something to become too stressful or too demanding on the brain. And then our brains initiate some kind of adaptive response, oftentimes by simply avoiding, right? And it's not always conscious. Or we might find a different way to do it if we have the skills. And over time, again, this will lead to that resistance and what we call faulty neuroception. And so I'm going to talk about neuroception. This is not fetal alcohol specific. So if you're thinking about other children, that's a good thing for you to be doing. And this is a big part of that book I recommended called Beyond Behaviors. Our brains are continuously, via mechanisms, assessing our safety. Right. And so these are not, again, in our executive functioning system, they're not conscious. They are unconscious. We cannot control how the brain responds until we develop a lot of executive functions as adults. So it's unreasonable to expect any kid or teenager to use their executive functioning if what's going on is unsafe neuroception. And these are ready to go the moment we come out of the womb. So within the first hours and days and months of life, an infant's brain is picking up on neuroception. Am I safe? Again, unconsciously. And the patterns start to develop. And it's through this process and our developmental pathways that we call this pre-executive functioning, but they eventually develop what we think of as an attention span. And we'll talk about that. Safety and connection with adults in these early days and months of life are going to promote the brain's understanding of safety in one way. So it's neuroception in one day. But if there's stress or trauma, whether it's abuse or neglect or hospitalization, maybe they were born premature, or their brain struggles with sensory regulation, maybe they're autistic, that can also put them down this path of faulty neuroception. And our neuroception will have an overall impact on brain development. When an infant and toddler feel safe, they can pick up on the patterns around the world. That's how they start learning. When they are unsafe, those patterns are not being picked up on because the brain is focused just on survival and through what we call a pathway, the red or the blue pathway. And again, this is a critical concept in polyvagal theory. And I would guess for the vast majority of us, we deal with some kind of faulty neuroception if we've had a traumatic past. And so as you learn about this, you will also learn coping skills for yourself. And part of Dr. Delahook's book is us looking at our own responses and our own neuroception and how that will impact the children that we're interacting with. So in other words, neuroception is our bottom brain, or the primitive brain, the older parts of the brain. Is the sense of safety to environments, situations, and people. I also have included in this in the conference my PDF for this. So I'm gonna, in order to stay on time, I'm gonna go through some of these pretty quickly, but you have all the information on your slides, so you're welcome to look at that. These slides are just going over how if we have ongoing safe or ongoing unsafe neuroception, it's going to impact any of us, all of us, in a moment, any given moment where it's happening, and in our bigger pictures. And it's that early childhood and stress that leads to what we call faulty neuroception, which is unsafe neuroception, but there's not actually anything unsafe going on. So the brain is tricking itself into thinking there's something happening. And so it is happening when our brains are sensing a threat when there actually is none. And this is going to cause a physiological response. And this is when we think of somebody going into fight or flight on one end, the red pathway, or shutting down, what we call the blue pathway. And shutting down, we mean in a immobilized state, not where we can kind of see them kind of struggle and they kind of go down a road of shutdown and then escalate. We're not talking about that. We're talking about kids who just like they cannot focus, they cannot connect, they're not able to hear, they're wandering around but unable to initiate. Those are a lot of the signs. And unfortunately, faulty neuroception can be triggered by many different things. And in my opinion, if you struggle with this as a child and you're constantly under stress, which a lot of them are, it comes to the point where any cognitive demand creates stress, right? Anything that's unfamiliar, even what we think of as easy. And even if we know they can do it, but their brain is so reactive, they're not even willing to look at the stuff, right? So stress of any type, in addition to all of these other practical examples and many others, can trigger faulty neuroception in the brain. And this relates to FASDs because just by the nature of the disorder, they will have been through some kind of trauma. The vast majority of the clients I work with in the state of Oregon are either in foster care or are adopted. And so just by that, we know there has been some trauma, a lot of early medical issues, maybe related to FASDs, maybe not. And so as you look through this list, we'll see none of this is restricted just to FASDs. This is an approach we should be taking for all children, and especially those with challenging behaviors. Clues that a child might have faulty neuroception. Having a mental health professional, of course, is the ideal situation, who's familiar with all of this, who can help us. But if they have constantly been dysregulated on that sensory system, if they're always reactive or oppositional, if they overreact to small stressors, all of that can be a part of this. Again, number one resource, please buy this. And if you're not able to come to part 2, here's some information about what I'm able to, or if you want to learn more from me, my website is www.cognitivesupports.com. I have a podcast called the It's a Brain Thing podcast, where we talk about various different elements of FASDs. I think, even if you're a professional, the information can be really valuable. And I also offer free videos on YouTube. So if you go to youtube.com/organ behavior, you can watch some of them. Maybe you can send them to parents that might be struggling with these issues at home, or to other teachers. Thank you very much, and I'll see hopefully most of you for part 2. Okay. We have one question in the chat box. They are available. Actually, they are not, because I just switched my website and I don't think I have switched them. So you can contact me through my website if you want me to send you a copy of that list, and I'll send it right on over to you. My website is www.cognitivesupports.com, and we'll put it in the chat right now.